Hi everyone, this is the Stollery channel and my name is Alex. Today we're going to continue talking about very mysterious events that took place in the 19th and 20th century, and we're going to touch on Australia. Watch until the end, it will be very interesting, as well as subscribe to the channel, put likes and share this video on social networks. In the early 1920s in Australia, the city of Melbourne, an amazing story took place. While doing preparatory excavation work for the future foundation of the Capitol Theatre on Swanston Street, workers found a vertically standing wooden fence in a layer of clay 3 feet deep. The boards of the fence were still quite solid and neatly lined up in rows. A wooden sidewalk was excavated at the base of the fence. This was a real archaeological mystery in 1923, because this fence was under a recently demolished building that had been built in 1865. Here's a brief chronology of events. The Capitol Theatre was built by a group of Melbourne businessmen. It was designed by noted American architects Walter Burley Griffin and Marion Mahoney Griffin. They created a stunning design that was way ahead of its time. Just look at the three-dimensional ceiling finish. In 1923, they created just a ceiling from the year 2000. Thousands of lamps with different colored filters created a crystal cave effect. This design was way ahead of its time. It can be ranked with other stunning and mysterious early 20th century pieces whose appearance was way ahead of its time. But there will be a separate video about the lost designs of the early 20th century. There's a lot of mystery in this subject. How people in the 20s used such stylish, unusual designs in the construction of buildings, cars, and airplanes. One strongly wonders where they took their inspiration from. How to go from the design of a primitive sidecar to the design of 1990 Jaguar cars. I'll show you later, that's a very clear example. It's like the designers of the 20s learned from some kind of textbook that was closed off from regular people. But none of that is relevant to the topic of this clip. The theater project was approved on February 9, 1923, and construction began. The site where the theater was to be built was an 1865 apartment building. These houses were demolished and a wooden fence was found 3 feet deep in the clay layer. Archaeologists in the 20s could not explain why a wooden fence was found in a layer of clay under a building built in 1865. What is it that makes the fence so unusual? And what makes it interesting is that the city of Melbourne itself was not founded as a European settlement until 1835. That date is also the date that the first European settlers arrived in the area. So there was no town here before 1835, and there can't have been any wooden fences. This story of the excavated fence was safely forgotten and only remembered in 2017. Construction work in 2017 uncovered an entire block of house foundations buried in clay. Here's a photo from the excavation in the Wesley Church neighborhood. We can see the surviving brick and stone walls that were completely submerged in clay. Melbourne is a very young city by historical standards. The first settlers arrived in 1835, built houses, and somehow their houses ended up abandoned and covered in clay in the 1860s. In place of these backfilled houses, new houses are being built in 1865, one of which was demolished in 1923 during the construction of the Capitol Theatre, and others were demolished in 2017. Also, during the reconstruction of an intersection on one of Melbourne's busiest streets, the remains of 2 mules were found in clay, and the cart they were pulling was found next to them. This is an even stranger story because if it was just an animal burial, why would there be a cart nearby? It turns out that the owner of the mules loved his animals so much that, according to ancient Egyptian customs, he buried the cart they were pulling next to them. Very strange things happened in Melbourne in the 19th century, but Australian scientists have found an explanation for it all. In their opinion, it's a very simple explanation. The first settlers built their homes in the lowlands, in swampy areas. Streets after rain became impassable crowds where horses and carts got stuck. Because of the dampness in the houses, people were often sick, so the city administration decided to make life easier for people and save them from dampness and dirt. In 1853, a law was passed that required residents of low-lying areas to fill their homes and lots with soil themselves. If a homeowner refused to bury their house, the city government raised the level of the lots themselves by collecting a forced fee from the lot owners. So that's how people would voluntarily and sometimes forcibly bury their houses. It's a good version, of course, from the historians, but there are a few things that confuse me. First of all, it's a fence. Let's say a man voluntarily backfills his house, but why doesn't he save his property? Because it's a new city, it seems to me that in a new place, building materials are always at a premium. Couldn't the person have removed the fence before backfilling the house and put it back in place after the ground was raised? But no, he doesn't take care of his property, he just backfills his accrued property with clay. Or there's the brick fireplace, because you could take it apart and then put it back together in the new house. But people didn't just bury fireplaces and fences, they threw good dishes and bottles. I think those are household necessities, especially on a continent that was just beginning to be settled. This story is a carbon copy of Seattle and Chicago. Settlers arrive, settle in the swampy areas. Then, when people get tired of living in the mud, they raise the ground level in the city by several meters. Please subscribe to Stollery channel and leave your comments. It is very interesting to read them and discuss this topic. Don't forget to like and share this video on social networks with others. Also subscribe to the channel in Telegram where there is information that cannot be posted on YouTube. Let's now check to see if Melbourne in the mid-19th century really was that badly waterlogged. In June 1835, the area where Melbourne now stands was surveyed by John Batman, who made a treaty with 8 chiefs of the Wurundjeri tribe to sell 600,000 acres of land. That's almost 930 square miles. In August, the first settlers arrived in these territories. In 1837, the city was named Melbourne, and a plan for the development of the city, the Robert Hoddle Plan, was adopted. From the discovery of gold in the state in the 1850s and the start of the gold rush, the city began to grow rapidly. Many of the city's most famous buildings were constructed in the 1850s. The Parliament Building, the Finance Building, the State Library, the University, the Central City blocks were well planned, and the city was laid out with numerous boulevards, gardens, and parks. One reads and marvels at how clearly planned and built everything was, only it all contradicts the story with the swampy area and the misshapen houses. Let's go back to Hoddle's 1837 plan. Melbourne was originally developed according to this plan. In this rectangle here, everything was built according to Hoddle's plan, which means that by 1853, there could not have been any improperly built houses in this location that the city government required to be filled in. Melbourne has the West Melbourne Swamp, first known as the Batman Swamp. John Batman described the swamp as an abundance of wildlife. Georgiana McCrae sketched the area, and her son George recalled that in 1841 it was a real lake, bright blue, almost oval, and full of clear salt water. Then, the sewage of Melbourne began to pour into this body of water, and it was written that it became a stinking menace to the city. In 1877, there were the first plans to drain the swamp. In 1900, the swamp was pretty much drained. So this swamp has nothing to do with the fact that in 1853, they were burying houses in the center of Melbourne. There were slums on the banks of the swamp, but they weren't built by the unemployed until the 1930s. We have a very interesting situation emerging. We have 2 official histories of the city. The first history is very correct and beautiful. Settlers came to the new land, and in 1837 a proper plan is adopted to build up the city with roads, boulevards, and parks. But for some reason this story says nothing about Melbourne being built on wetlands, the roads were impassable, the houses were damp, and people were getting sick, so the city government forced people to bury their houses. These are all details in Melbourne's history that only came to light after 2017. When several blocks of houses buried under clay were excavated. Only then did a bizarre document from 1853 surface in which authorities forced citizens to bury their homes. And this document seems to exist only in electronic form, but it's unlikely that there's an original printed on paper anywhere. Somehow in 1923, when they dug up the fence covered with clay, nobody even remembered this law, and they only remembered it in 2017. This rectangle of Melbourne was developed according to Hoddle's plan, which means there shouldn't be any misshapen houses in it, but somehow they are there. We have to believe either the first version of Melbourne's history, where everyone built according to a plan, or disbelieve the first story and believe the second story, which says people built houses without any plan in the lowlands, in some swamps, and after they built everything, they buried their property. Here's even an 1851 photograph that shows how thoroughly Melbourne was built. This is the second Prince's Bridge. And in this 1898 photo, you can see that the old building on the left does not stand in a low-lying area, but rather on an elevated area. So let's collectively decide which story we're going to believe. The one that Melbourne was built according to the approved plan, or the other one that Melbourne was so badly planned initially that in 1853 houses had to be urgently backfilled, even throwing in personal belongings. And I don't even know which of these stories to put the mules and cart found under a Melbourne street. Or maybe we don't have to believe any of these stories because we have this interesting date popping up, 1850, mid-19th century, a time of fires in America and pictures of empty cities in Europe. Please subscribe, give likes, share this video with your friends. Thank you so much for watching to the end.